This is TWiT.
There's a kind of convergence of the rumor mongers on March 8th. Rene, I know you're a close observer of all this. Is that credible? Do you think that's the date?
I think right now in the decades of the 2020s, these things can shift. Like it's a pre-recorded virtual presentation, and if anything changes, Apple hasn't announced it. So until we get the ads, until we get the invitations, like the emails, those sorts of things, then it's locked. I think it's early. Typically, Apple holds them later in March or June, but the March event moves around so much, and there's not always a March event, that it's a wild card to me. So yeah, it absolutely could be March 8th, but it could be any week that Apple chooses to hold it.
In other words, they could be right, and it could be changed.
Yes. So logistics are different. They don't have to rent a building like that has other rental people. Yeah, like Yerba Buena or like
this
the
is why
Civic
they
Center
built the campus, really, in the Steve Jobs
sort
Theater.
of, but they built it and then they didn't always use it. Like they built it, then they went to Chicago, and then they went to Brooklyn, and then they went to
weird. Well. Now, here's the question. Bloomberg, Mark Gurman and others, I think, are all saying, and I think this is probably, pretty obvious, new iPhone SE with 5G and the A15 processor, new iPad Air were due. It'll look kind of like the iPad Pros, like the iPad Mini. Anything else is what inquiring minds
look identical,
want to know.
like the iPad Air got its big redesign at the end of 2020, but then the Mini got the same redesign last year, but got the better processor. And I think this is just about leveling that playing field again. So you'll get the A15 and you'll get slightly better camera. So it'll be like the Apple's version of a spec bump, basically. And then the third rumor is for a Mac. It sounds like the iMac Pro has been delayed a little while, or I hate saying delayed for a product that doesn't exist. It feels like that's that Vulcan law, like nothing unreal can exist. It feels like that's not ready yet. So my hopes, my dreams are pinned on a Mac Mini Pro at this point.
That's what my hopes are pinned on too. Do you think it's reasonable though? Or, I mean, why June seems like a more likely target date?
I think June might be the Mac Pro preview, and maybe
they
the
don't want to
iMac
overlap
Pro.
that. Maybe okay, that's interesting.
They could. I mean, I need a new Mac in my life, Leo. That's
the thing.
Mark
we can't be driven by our desires, Rene.
Mark had a good newsletter on Sunday where he sort of laid out what he thought was reasonable for the Mac roadmap, and I think he's pretty good at that. And that was like a new Mac maybe at this event, and that sounds like that would be the Mac Mini,
but not a Mac.
The iMac.
Okay, because Digitimes 60.8% accurate, according to Apple Tracker. Digitimes
randomly accurate.
Randomly, in other words, a little better than 50/50. Says it's going to be an M2 based MacBook Pro, which would be a low end. Which is, by the way, you've explained this many times. It's confusing. The M1 will continue to be the high end as they add more cores, more GPUs. The M2
more dies even.
More dies, right? You could have like 4 M1 processors, but the M2 is going to be low end initially.
The A15,
because it's based on the A15, so it'll just be an A15. It'll be won't be a spec bump. It'll be a capability.
Faster single core that's more power efficient because it's a cooler chip in general, which is great for but Mark put the M2s, the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, M2 Mac Mini, and the M2 iMac towards the end of the year. And it starts to get fuzzy whether that would be an A15 M2 or an A60. Like, this is such a deep rabbit hole we could get into.
Well, and Apple should be aware that this is confusing. Like, if you introduce an M2, people are going to think it's better. It's one better.
It'll be, but it's always been that way. Like, again, they put out the A13 iPhone, and then they put out the A12Z iPad Pro. Yeah, but and that caused the same confusion.
But we weren't so aware. Most people weren't so aware of the designations A13X and all that. But I think M1 and M2 are really big brands, and
they should change the branding. They should call it like Junior or like Air. Like, they should call it M2
clearer.
Air or M2 Mini. So that people understand it's like a lower end, low power architecture.
And then for people like you, they could say, well, it's an A15. You know what that means. So Mark says at least one new Mac on March 8th, but he isn't sure which it'll be. high-end Mac Mini, which Rene and I are voting for. Not that we have,
which is weird, right? Because it's been decided. Like they know which one is ready. It's not like that's a mystery.
Yeah.
So how come people like? It's always weird when someone doesn't know something when it's about to happen.
Or he says Apple has at least 4 new Macs powered by M2 chips, but he thinks those will be later in the year, as you said. MacBook Air, that low-end MacBook Pro. It's basically a successor to the original M1 13-inch. There'll be an M2.
Well, so it's the new enclosure, the new 14. Supposedly, it's the new 14-inch enclosure, but with an M2 in it instead of an M1X or sorry, an M1.
So it will
Pro
be
and
14,
M1 Max.
not 13.
Yeah, and they might take a port away from us just to be petulant. Looks that's what they do with the lower end one.
No port for you. 24-inch iMac, a successor to the colorful iMacs of last year.
Well, I shouldn't say petulant. It's got if it follows true to form, there's 3 USB and 3 Thunderbolt controllers on the Pro and Max.
It's the issue.
There's
is
only
the chip,
2 of each.
The chip's controllers is really the issue. It's the capability of the die. All right. I guess all we'll have to do is wait. It's only a couple more. It's a month.
I made a video on this yesterday with an animated timeline, Leo. It was so confusing to me. I don't do animation a lot. I made a little timeline moving across,
I gotta see this.
dropping little Macs onto it as it went because I needed to figure this out.
I got it. Wait a minute. All right, I'm going to pull this now. Yeah. Is this the event links one or the?
No, the recent one, the M2
M2 Max leaks super fake renders. Okay.
Yeah, I like making my own super fake renders. But so a little timeline is going to pop up, but because it seems like to me, well, it should be up in a second.
Oh, okay.
That's my version of Mark typing. That's what I thought Mark typing.
Is that stock footage, or do you shoot that?
No, they wouldn't let me shoot Mark typing on a Bloom. So I started making little timelines.
Oh, here's the timeline.
When the different products are.
Oh, look at this.
Yeah, and
this
I fill that in as a video goes.
This is cute. I love it. Smash the subscribe button, man. I love you. You're getting better and better. I tell you,
it's taking me longer to edit now, but I'm putting a lot more work into it.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's the way of the world, right?
But it seems like they might want to get the M1 Pro and M1 Max not out of the way, but they're going to want to release those before they get into M2, because I think it will be even more confusing if M2 starts coming out and M1 Pro and M1 Max haven't finished coming out. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe I'm overthinking that.
No, I think this is all we have is overthinking.
And it's not like Intel. Like the Intel transition, all those chips existed. Like Apple just had to go through and choose. And they're Apple, so they're like, we want this and that. But all those chips were done. Apple has to build and scaling a chip is hard. Like taking an M1 and making an M1 Max, that's a lot of work in like just getting the universal memory and the fabric and the memory bandwidth. And doing like quad die is going to take work too, because those dies have to talk to each other in a way that preserves everything that's good about universal memory and massive bandwidth to begin with. So it is a non-trivial amount of work. But then once that's all done, incrementing them, I think, is it's more of a marathon and less of a sprint.
Andy, any thoughts? What are you voting for? As if our vote matters.
Yeah, I know.
Andy's God mode.
I kind of imagine this as being kind of a low key event. Like let's fill in, let's improve what's already there, particularly in the iPad range. What are people going to need to be buying in bulk, like in March and April? And usually you think about people who are buying things in readiness for September and October. So you're talking about bulk purchases for education. So that really points very heavily to a lot of iPad updates. I'm still very mystified as to like where Apple is going to go, like in the Pro line. I mean, I don't mean in the Pro chips. I mean that the traditional line of here is the Pro Max. Here are the ones that we're trying to get as much performance as possible out of this thing, and do a little bit of a flex if we can. If we can, for people who have $10,000, we will make sure that you have a very, very happy and very, 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 very well ducted fan experience. Are they going to try to find the limits of what they can do with the iPad mini case and have that be sort of like the aspirational mid-level Mac, meaning that you can buy one for as little as $600? That's very strategically kitted out. But if you wanted to check off all the boxes on the website, you can buy a $3,000 to $4,000 build that is just an absolute screamer. Nice. Or are they going to want to start to steer those people towards an actual Mac Pro? And there was some rumors, rumors bordering on speculation last year about like a Mac Pro Mini. I don't know whether people were talking about that, who feel as though they had access to information were talking about a high-spec Mac Mini, or actually let's take a Mac Pro, huge, like $900 caster wheels Mac Pro, but also make a smaller cut version of this that is more affordable, more portable, more accessible. I don't know where they're going to go with this. I wouldn't have even bet money on them doing an iMac Pro, given that the original one was kind of a stopgap when they saw how much of a failure the cylindrical Mac Pro was, where they had to get something out that would actually work, that developers would actually be able to use for their work. So I always thought that the iMac Pro was a stopgap that may or may not even survive the Apple Silicon transition.
Interesting. I have the iMac
My understanding
Pro,
is that
$5,000, and it's really aged poorly. It's not.
Some people still love it, but like my understanding is that the iMac Pro isn't like a successor to the original iMac Pro, just that whatever they put the M1 Pro and M1 Max chip in is going to get Pro in the name, like MacBook Pro, iMac Pro, Mac Mini Pro. It'll be like a unification of branding more than like a spiritual successor.
Well,
some people are panicking going, I want a bigger iMac, but I don't want a Pro. And like, that'll be fine. You'll be okay. It's going to have that name.
So even if it has an M1 Max in it, it'll still be a Pro.
Yeah, can you imagine iMac Max? Like if they took it to the extent of the phones,
you can't do the Max. Yeah.
How much Max can you max out a Max of a Max could be maxed? It's just
so a Pro or a Max is a Max.
Mad Max
is a Pro.
Yeah,
yeah.
But that would be new if they decided that. I like the logic of that kind of nomenclature, but that would be a new extension of the brand. So you've never had a Mac Mini has always been a Mac Mini. Maybe you can afford to fill it up with lots of money. Maybe you could just simply get the case with as little functional stuff as you can. AM radio, no factory air, roll up windows. The idea of having a Mac Mini Pro, that's tantalizing. Like, would they have to create a new tooling for a case? Would they have to simply say we're gonna make a Mac Mini nothing that is even smaller, even more compact, even easier to hide on a desk or mount on the back of a screen? But when we make the Mac Mini Pro, we're gonna make that twice as thick so that you can pop off the top and add new SSD storage. You can make modifications to it as you need.
Well, as long as we're speculating
it'll be
wildly.
colors, Andy. Yeah, it'll be colorfuls for the regulars and then black and white.
I also think that because Apple now makes a display again, the XDR, and maybe we'll be making more, maybe they'll see the iMac as more for the style-conscious consumer, and not. I agree with you, maybe Andy, that the Pro was a stopgap and not a planned future, and that assume the Pro is going to want a Mac Pro or a Mac Mini Pro. The problem is if they do the shrunken Mac Pro, as some have rumored, which is awfully cute, it'll verge into mini territory, won't it?
So it's less shrunken, and it's mostly just taking out those giant Xeon and giant RMNA cards. That reduces the size immensely. So I think like when people talk about it being smaller, it's just smaller because it doesn't have those two shield helicarriers.
But it could be a lot smaller. Anymore. Those things are
they're massive. When you look at the open picture, it's like 1/3 the size.
Yeah.
So
you really
the power might stay the same because you could put 4 like in a 300 watt enclosure. You could, that's my other question. Like you could put 4 M1 Maxes in there and still not fill up that thermal envelope. But the interesting thing is like an iMac Pro with an M1 Max would have 64 gigabytes of storage, but the previous iMac Pro had 256 gigabytes. The Mac Pro was 1.5 terabytes of storage max. Like how does Apple scale any of that? And like to your point, how do they address PCIe expansion slots? Like that's never been a thing with Apple Silicon.
Well, now that you don't have to do graphics cards, you're not going to have RAM slots because they're all on die. I think they're not expandable. I think, but what are you going to put in there? That is
some
there
of the iPads had off-package RAM. Like I think the X chips, the extended chips, did have off-package RAM. So does Apple have like an ugly or a brilliant interface that lets you put in off-package RAM if you need it for like a giant project? And then do you have like a RAID card that you can put in there that interfaces with
that
Apple
makes sense.
Silicon?
There are, I'm thinking of what kinds of Pro applications, and there certainly are machine learning applications that require giant amounts of RAM, and you might want to be willing to do off-board RAM, but that's such a specialized thing you wouldn't necessarily want to
some
manufacture
studios, like some of the higher end 3D stuff,
a lot of
rendering, there's a lot of high end stuff. Yeah, Alex's photogrammetry.
Yeah.
So and analysts who are doing science and analysts who are doing like massive data sets.
Yeah,
I've always my hoped for transition for the product line has always been, I think that my ideal would be that there would be a desktop Mac Pro where the difference between the two is that one has PCIe slots, one does not, but it has like M.2 for SSDs, and you can have a couple of SSDs in there.
The world has changed a lot,
upgradability
since the Mac Pro, but you don't have to put in SATA drives. You don't. I mean, so you really could still be fairly compact and fairly expandable. And I wonder if pros are willing to hang stuff off of Thunderbolt 4. Like, that's pretty fast.
Well, I mean, there also could be a Xeon and a Navi 3 Mac Pro that tide us over for another year while Apple gets us ultra high end.
Really?
There's been rumors of that too. There's been rumors that they're going to keep an Intel one around for another 2 years. Remember, like the people on production pipelines work slowly. Like Pixar and ILM, like work at a different schedule.
Yeah, they don't care, and they probably don't want to have to recompile for ARM.
But how would that affect didn't they do a hard promise that we're going to have the Apple Silicon transition complete by the end of 2022?
So you get the M1 Max Mac Pro, but then there'd still also be an updated, like they make basically just a press release that says now the old Mac Pro comes with the latest Xeon and Navi 3 chipsets.
I think you're right. I think they will do that because there certainly is a market for that. I mean, Pro Tools is still running.
It gives them some breathing room to get like the really, really high power Apple, so like the really crazy high power silicon out.
Yeah, I think that may very well be.
I still, my head still spins when I think about it. Imagine Apple Silicon that requires massive cooling. Like, imagine they said, "Screw it, we're gonna have like water cooled systems. We're gonna have like Skynet like power."
Well, there were rumors about a vapor chamber for A16 because like the A15 with the 5th GPU core inside an iPhone Pro does ramp down really fast if you put it under load. Not many things put it under load, but if you do like your Genshin Impact benchmarks, it will throttle down.
Sure, but that's a package the size of a Hershey bar.
Yes.
Wow. You know, it's really
Cadbury
interesting.
Bar here, Leo.
We get really engaged when we talk about Macs. And I know that Mac is a fraction of Apple's business and revenue. But we do call the show MacBreak Weekly, and us old timers, we love our Macs.